Now, the subject that I'm going to be looking at today is principally about Russia, and to show you how what is happening in Russia, and in particular what Mr. Putin is doing, is very much in line with what we would expect from Ezekiel chapter 38. Now, Russia's dream, you know, there was a person before Russia in the name of Nebuchadnezzar, and he had a dream, and he dreamt about what lay ahead. How great was his kingdom going to be? Who would come after him? And I thought it was quite fascinating that I came across this article recently, Putin's Middle East dream. There's no question, in my opinion, that Vladimir Putin has got a dream, he's got an objective, and he very carefully and craftily is going about establishing the veracity of that dream. Just once again, let us think about the wonderful words penned by Brother Thomas over 100 years ago, 150, 160 years ago. The future movements of Russia are predicted in the scriptures of truth. When Russia makes its grand move for the building up of its image empire, then let the reader know that the end of all things, as at present constituted, is at hand. And I thought about that wonderful statement by Brother Thomas. Of course, everything he wrote and believed in was solidly scripturally based. And so the Bible, to us and to the world at large, brothers and sisters, is the world's best early warning system. And so many authors today, so many commentators are making us realise that Russia is going somewhere. She may not have been going somewhere 20 years ago, but she's certainly going somewhere today. And the person responsible for that, principally, is Vladimir Putin, because he has now been president for most of this century, as far as Russia is concerned. And even when he comes to the end of his current term, he still has the option of taking up another 6-year term as the president of Russia. I'd just like you to cast your minds back to 1854. This was the time of the Crimean War, when Great Britain and France, principally, went to war against Russia in this area that we know so well today as Crimea. And the reasons why Great Britain and France opposed Russia, because they were concerned that Russia was determined to come down south through the Black Sea and take over Constantinople. That was Russia's dream then. And mind you, brothers and sisters, it's still her dream today, to take Constantinople. And we know that from the scriptures, of course, when the king of the north shall come across the ruler in Constantinople as part of their southern drive into the Middle East. Here's an interesting cartoon, a comic map of Europe in 1877, and it depicts Russia as this gigantic octopus with its tentacles spreading out in all directions, but principally spreading down into the Middle East. And then someone has been smart enough to use that concept, and again in the year 2008 they had a cartoon with the modern Russia under the control of Putin, epitomised once again by an octopus, and whatever they were doing 100 years ago, they're up to it again. So you see there's a bit of a historical background, a bit of history behind what Russia wants to do in the Middle East. Then we jump forward a few years and we come to what was known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was an agreement drawn up by the British gentlemen Sir Mark Sykes and Georges Picot of France. Now they secretly drew up this division of spoils in the Middle East that would come about, as they hoped, from the carnage of World War I. Now, what is interesting about this agreement was Britain and France, in cahoots with Russia, at that stage Russia was still under the control of the Tsars, and in the agreement I want you to look at the territory that Russia was going to get. They were going to get Constantinople, and they were going to get eastern Turkey. Now that was going to happen. As it turned out, we had the revolution in Russia in 1917, and the government and the Tsar and his family were thrown out. But the rest of the agreement, to a degree, remained as envisaged. Britain got the area down south, Palestine and Transjordan, whereas France gained a lot of influence to the north of that, particularly in the area of Syria and Lebanon. As I mentioned, in 1917, thanks Anton, it was the Russian Revolution. There was actually two revolutions. There was one in February 1917 where the Romanov dynasty was overthrown after 300 years and the Tsar was ousted. And then a few months later, in October 1917, there was the, you might call the real Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks took over and Lenin became the head of the country. It's fascinating, isn't it? That's 100 years ago this year. And what have we seen with regard to Russia? It's gone through so much turmoil and to's and fro's on power, and yet today we have Russia in the position that we would expect it to be in prior to the coming of our Lord. Now that map there shows the total area that once belonged to USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But in 1991, the USSR came to an end. The Soviet Union collapsed. And years later, when Vladimir Putin became the president, he made it very clear on more than one occasion why he would love to get back to the times before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. He said the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And so all those independent nations that are now listed on that map with their own governments, their own armies, their own everything, they are the territories that Vladimir Putin would love to come back under Russian control. And he's going about it in a very interesting way. This is headed, Putin resurrects Russian revisionism. Now what is that? Let me just read that to you. Russian history has a large preponderance of autocratic, iron-willed leaders who expanded their power and prestige at the expense of their own people. So these tyrants are painted as saviours rather than oppressors. In this interpretation, cold-blooded leaders who ruled with an iron fist, such as Lenin and Stalin after him, were good for the country. Putin wants to project his own image as a modern, benevolent dictator, capable of restoring Russia's global influence and bringing it prosperity. So this concept of historical revisionism is a real key pillar upon which Vladimir Putin is waving his flag. And in the history written by Putin's hand, would you believe it, Stalin is presented to the Russian people as the ultimate Russian leader, expanding the power of Russia at the expense of American policy. And commentators have been able to see how that Putin will stop at nothing to stay in power. He wants to resurrect the USSR, not in the same way as it once existed, but he wants to resurrect the power, the prestige, the glory that was associated with Russia before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so, when it's necessary and when it suits him, Vladimir Putin will rewrite the past. So Russia is now returning to greatness thanks to the great power that Putin himself has consolidated. This is history Russian style. So here are some periodicals headlines. Putin, he once was Premier or the Prime Minister. He then became President. Then he went back to being Prime Minister. Now he's President again. But he's taking it a step further now. He wants to be the modern Tsar. He wants to be the modern political and religious leader of the mighty nation of Russia. And what can the West do about it? Russia, unquestionably, is becoming very resurgent. So how can the West counter these great moves by Russia? Let's just remember this wonderful quote in Ezekiel 38, which paints the scene prior to the invasion of Israel. Son of man, set thy face toward Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So the prophet was able to see that in the last days, one would rise up, a Gog, someone that's powerful, gigantic, proud, someone who's at the top. He's in control of Western Europe, principally described there as the land of Magog, and nothing seems to stand in his way. And talking about Russian revisionism, I thought this was interesting. Vladimir Putin, wound up like a little toy by the previous great leaders in Lenin and Stalin, wound up by them in spirit to recreate the great Russian Empire. As I said before, Vladimir Putin not only mourns the loss of the once great territory and nation of USSR, he mourns the collapse of that, and he's bent. He is determined to rebuild it and restore the glory of Imperial Russia. Now, in the chapter that we are well aware of in Ezekiel 38, it says there that in verse 4, God says, I will turn you back. But I like the net version here, and there are other versions similar, which read like this: I will turn you around. I will put hooks into your jaws and bring you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all of them fully armed, a great company with shields of different types, all of them armed with swords. So the prophet could foresee, writing under inspiration, that at some future date, Russia would be turned around. Now, I know there are views on what that means, and I don't know whether we can conclusively pinpoint the exact timing of when Russia would be turned around. But personally, I like to think that the turning around started when Vladimir Putin became president in the year 2000. And I'll show you why. Because prior to that, and certainly after the collapse of the USSR, Russia became a second-rate power. And the Western world looked upon Russia as a bit of a joke. They thought her glory days were over, and it would only be a matter of time before the whole Western culture and the Western influence would take over Russia. But not to be, says God. I'm going to turn that nation around, and I'm going to put hooks into her jaws and drag her into the Middle East. I hope you can see that. It's not the best slide for clarity, but it's under the heading of Russia is being turned back. Originally there was communism, which went until 1991. And during that time we had the Cold War era, the KGB, the spy system, anti-West. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. And for a brief period of about 8 or 9 years, the Russians dabbled in trying to make their country like the West. And they tried to build up their economy based upon the Western economy. So there was glasnost, there was perestroika. The Cold War came to an end. They went out of their way to cooperate with the West. But to their shock horror, to their shame, nothing worked. This is not Russian style. Russians are used to living under a dictator. And they couldn't handle living like the West. So when Putin came to power in the year 2000, we had a return to the KGB, albeit under a different name, anti-West, communistic ways, even restoring the old Soviet anthem, a verse of which is down below. In this respect, a well-known writer, Charles Moore, editor of The Spectator, had this to say: lessons from the 30s, that is when Hitler was in control, show us why we can't appease Vladimir Putin. Russia's leader is toying with the West and shows all the traits of a dictator on the march. European leaders in the 30s were woefully wrong in failing to understand what it means to be up against a dictator. When you've got someone like a Gog, one at the top, who is in control, the West actually fails miserably on how to handle that situation, as history has shown when the West was confronted with that maniac in Adolf Hitler. And Charles Moore says the same error is being repeated today. In The Guardian newspaper just a few months ago was this comment: Putin is not alone in thinking the way he does. In other words, he's not a loner in Russia. Any successor is likely to have similar views. We have to deal with Russia as it is, not spin fantasies about what it could be like or would be like without Putin. I thought there's a real fascinating statement, a real insight as to what's going on in Russia. Because I'm not saying, and I don't think anyone here would dare to say categorically that Vladimir Putin is the Gog. But he has all the hallmarks of a Gog. He is doing everything that we would expect Gog to do. But taking those comments from The Guardian, don't fool yourselves, says the writer, to the West. Don't fool yourselves in thinking, if only we could get rid of Vladimir Putin, then Russia would revert to what it was like before the year 2000. And the writer is saying, you must be joking. Do you think Vladimir Putin is the only one that thinks like he does? There are others that would step in and take Russia in the same direction. So what has been going on? In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia and moved into South Ossetia, and her influence in northern Georgia is now very, very profound. In 2014, Russia invaded and annexes Crimea. The Crimean War, over 100 years before that, when Russia wanted to move south. Now Russia is moving again south, and by taking Crimea, she has got control of the Black Sea, and her navy ships, the submarines, whatever she likes, can freely pass through the Bosphorus. Only recently, people in Moscow attended a concert marking the 3rd anniversary of Crimea's reunification with Russia. You see, the Russian people, they like Vladimir Putin because he is a strong man, he's a dictator. He gives the people confidence. It makes them feel as though they are equal to the rest of the world. And we naturally, brothers and sisters, don't have any axe to grind with people. We've got no problem with Russian people, but we feel sorry for them because they're being dragged into admiring and almost worshipping a man who is going to lead them, if not he, but his successor, into another world war. In that little cartoon on the top left, just when Ukraine thought that they could escape the clutches of the Soviet or the Russian power, and there they are walking across the field, and at the last minute, the hand of Russia, whether it be in the hand of Lenin or Stalin, or the toy that was wound up by them in Vladimir Putin, grabs the foot and says, no you don't, no you don't. You're not going anywhere without our say-so. And to prove the point, he took over Crimea. Well, what about Syria? Syria represents one of the 2 pillars of Russia's strategy in the Middle East, the other being Iran. Syria hosts naval and air bases in her territory, and she has signed a deal with Russia only a few days ago. It was ratified on the 27th of July, whereby Russia has 49-year leases with the option of taking up 25-year extensions that enables a Russian military presence in the Levant and the Mediterranean. So this deal that was signed, ratified only a few days ago, demonstrates clearly Russia's revival as an important player on the global stage. So you have the heading as the Russian bear returns to the Middle East, Russia's Syrian air base to house a permanent military squadron. And the last slide down the bottom right-hand side is very, very interesting because recently the Russians, in association with the United States of America, have been able to negotiate a truce in the southwestern area of Syria. There, the Syrian government has been fighting rebel forces, but they've been able to organise a truce, as I said, mastered by Russia and the United States of America. And part of the deal is that Russia has been allowed to bring in military police in a little Syrian town called Konitra, if that's how you pronounce it. But that town of Konitra is only a few kilometres from the Israeli border, right on the border of Israel. So you can see what's been going on. Firstly, there was Georgia. Then there was Crimea. But now, further south, Russia is right into Syria and right on the border of the nation of Israel. We can see clearly, brothers and sisters, the way in which Russia is establishing a big foothold in the Middle East area. Have we heard of Libya? Of course we have in Ezekiel 38. Libya is going to be there with Russia when she invades the Middle East. According to Debka's files, military and intelligence sources, President Vladimir Putin began to envision a second Mediterranean base on the coast of Benghazi, twin to Hamimim in Syria's Latakia. This one would accommodate Russian naval as well as air units. Ezekiel 38 is certainly coming to life before our eyes. And so the scenario that we would expect, brothers and sisters, from Ezekiel 38 is certainly developing rapidly. Now, I've showed this slide once before, but I think it's just a great quotation from Brother Thomas. Gog is styled the prince of Ros, Mosk and Tubal. That is, autocrat of the Russians, Muscovites and Siberians, or of all the Russias. But he is also styled Gog of the land of Magog as well. It affirms that he is sovereign of Magog, that is the area of Central Europe, as well as prince of all the Russias. Whoever reads Ezekiel can hardly entertain a doubt that Gog is the name of a sovereign, one at the top, and Magog, that of his people. So when it says Gog of the land of Magog, it's portraying a situation whereby the despotic tyrant ruler of Russia is also in control of the territory of Central Europe. And in the Guardian paper only 2 or 3 months ago, there was an article, and in that article it says Putin is an autocrat with the consent of the governed. The Russian people like having strong autocrats. It gives them prestige, a sense of belonging, that they are amongst the strong people of the world. Again, from Brother Thomas, we have seen that Magog is the region extending from the Ros, or Russia, to the Rhine, comprehending Wallachia, Transylvania, Hungary and Germany. So, this is how he describes the opening verse of Ezekiel. Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the emperor of Germany, Hungary, etc., and autocrat of Russia, Muscovy and Tobolsky. What an amazing insight that Brother Thomas had into the scriptures, the prophecies that we know so well, writing those words a century and a half ago. And he could foresee the time when Russia would be making moves into the areas that we now see it happening. One day, by what means or how, it's a bit hard to tell at the moment, but one day Russia is really going to be in control of what's going on in the EU countries. And talking of the EU, Brother Thomas had this to say about Great Britain. As to whether Great Britain would be part of the consolidation of powers under the head of Gog. I have not named Britain. Although the island was part of the Roman dominion, existing theories require Britain to be counted in, but I have nothing to do with them, he says, in Elpis Israel. Now, we have had to wait until only recently to see the moves being undertaken to finally remove Great Britain from her association with the European Union. It caused a tremendous shock to people all around the world. But surely, brothers and sisters, it did not create a tremendous shock for ourselves, because we expected from our knowledge of Scripture that Britain, sooner or later, would have to come out of the organisation of the European Union. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. First there was Brexit, and then Theresa May decided to call a snap election. And when she called it, all the pundits were saying she was heading for an election landslide. And they considered her to be the best leader they could have in negotiating the best Brexit deal. Well, would you believe it? When the election was held, she only just scraped in with the support of a small party in Northern Ireland. May clings on to save EU exit. Now, it's fascinating to look at what's happening there in Great Britain. It's fascinating to see the way she came out of Europe, or she will come out of Europe in a couple of years' time. And when that election result came through, a lot of commentators thought, is the Brexit deal now to be torn up and Britain will go back to the EU? But I believe, brothers and sisters, we've got to have confidence and to recognise, as Daniel told us, the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. And I believe that that Brexit deal is for good. Britain is out of the EU. She has got a role to play in the time to come, but not in association with the European powers. Now, just across the canal was the election in France. There were two main contenders for the presidency. One was a lady called Marine Le Pen. Her policy was based on, she wanted France out of the EU and out of NATO. And again, political commentators were saying she had a good chance of winning. But what happened? A very young man, a very young candidate who hardly anyone knew beforehand, suddenly won the election. And Emmanuel Macron embraces the EU. He wants to put France back in the picture. And so when he was elected, who was the first person that he turned to? It was the president, or prime minister, I can't remember what she's called, of Germany, Angela Merkel. They got together and they just were so overjoyed that two like-thinking world leaders are now in control of Magog and Gomer. That is really Western Europe. That is the EU. You take Germany and France out of the equation, the EU won't exist. And there was touch and go, perhaps, as to whether Marine Le Pen would get in. And if she got in, the whole EU dream would have been torn apart. But Macron got in. And there he is, confidently walking in some ceremony past the very neatly dressed guard of the French soldiers. And there's no question that there is a special relationship now between France and Germany, and sooner or later, by whatever means, Russia is going to be there with them. And talking about France and Germany, there was an article recently in the Australian magazine. Ungrateful Europeans out to punish the UK. You see, the Europeans have hated Great Britain for pulling out of the EU, and they're throwing up all sorts of obstacles, mainly monetary, to make it hard for Britain to keep faith with her determination to get out of the EU. The Eurocrats in Brussels are extremely angry over Britain's withdrawal from the EU. And the writer, who is the current Solicitor General for the New South Wales Government, Michael Sexton, said this: "There is something extraordinary about Britain receiving moral lectures from the French and Germans when it is little more than 70 years, a span of less than one lifetime, since the Germans murdered a significant portion of the European population, and France only survived as a nation because it was saved by the British and the Americans." Now, that's a fact, isn't it? In 2 world wars, France was saved by allies. If it was left to France herself, she wouldn't exist. But now you have the French and the Germans so confident in where they're going that they can afford to turn their backs on Great Britain and make it hard for her to exist outside the EU. We turn to Trump for a moment. He's been the most incredible president, I think, that we have come across in all our lifetimes. He is so unpredictable, he's so volatile, He can be very crass, he can be very rude, he can be very terrible in the way he speaks to people. I think that the release of the tape recording of the phone call between President Trump and Turnbull, the Prime Minister of our country, is most revealing. Even there, he came across in a very dominant way, trying to get out of a deal that had already been agreed to with President Obama. But the main beef that President Trump had with Europe was this. NATO has been in existence since about 1949. And President Trump, rightly so, has said to the Europeans, I'm sick of this. I'm sick of the Americans paying the most money just to help you European powers not get into trouble. And he went to a NATO meeting and he told them, and you can see there that Angela Merkel doesn't look very happy, but he said to them, the United States has been treated very, very, very unfairly by many countries over the years, and that's going to stop. And in a number of ways, President Trump made it clear to the EU leaders that he was not going to allow the US to be taken for a ride and to be fleeced of her money and her wealth and her resources just to prop up nations in the EU that don't want to spend money for their own defence. And he says it's coming to an end. So much so that the question was asked, will Trump abandon Europe? And I think Trump will, if not Trump, his successor. Here's an article written by Sir James Wolfenson, who was the former World Bank president. He's actually an Australian citizen. He's a Jew, as you would expect. This is what he had to say. America's global leadership and power is in greater peril than at any time since World War II. Now, the reason why he says that is not because the US does not have a superior army, air force, navy. That's not the point. The point is that you have such an erratic leader in Trump in charge that no one knows from one day to the next as to what his plan is. And whereas in previous generations, the Western world could always look to the US for support, for strength and help in time of trouble, the writer says that's no longer the case. When you listen to President Trump, so many of the things that were said or believed previously are being challenged. Whether to look at questions of whether the US in terms of military power enters areas or doesn't. And President Trump has made it clear that when it comes to the future, as far as he is concerned with the USA, it's going to be USA first, we'll look after our interests, and the rest of the world afterwards. And the Europeans haven't heard language like that before, and it's made them troubled. So much so that one writer, the Canadian Foreign Minister, had this to say. The fact that our friend and ally, USA, has come to question the very worth of its mantle of global leadership puts into sharper focus the need for the rest of us to set our own clear and sovereign course. Now, that was in Canada. Angela Merkel had this to say in one of her press conferences. Europe must be ready to look after itself. Merkel says Europe can no longer rely on allies. So what is developing, brothers and sisters, is the classic scenario that Ezekiel 38 presents. You have Europe not aligned with the Tarshish powers. You have Europe, in a sense, all by itself. And when the chips are down, where is Europe going to turn? And I think we can foresee that what will happen is that Russia will step in and in a very benevolent way say to the Europeans, we share your views on the US. I think it'd be better, says the Russian leader, if you put your arm into our arm and we walk forward together. Here's a great article. Now, I'll just tell you that this article comes from a magazine called The Trumpet. And now some of you may not know, or some may know, that The Trumpet is a quasi-political / religious magazine produced by the old... I can't think of their name now, Herbert W. Armstrong's religion. And Herbert W. Armstrong was quite a well-known figure back in his day. He knew quite a bit about the Bible, but he liked to twist things now and again. But this writer, I think, only a couple of weeks ago, puts his finger on the pulse. What makes the Pope's interview with La Repubblica unique is that it marked the first time Pope Francis has openly stated that a federal Europe, now that means the European powers coming together, whether it will be a federal Europe or whether it will be a coalition of individual states giving their agreement to go in a certain way, he says that a federal Europe is necessary to counterbalance the United States. This is the Pope speaking. Even many Catholics do not grasp that Vatican City is more than the headquarters of a religion. It is a nation-state participating in political machinations involving empires. And I know that bit in green may be a bit hard to read, but it says Europe needs to assume, as soon as possible, a federal structure. The Pope said either Europe becomes a federal community or otherwise it will count for nothing in the world. And the Pope is certainly making his presence known as to where he wants Europe to go. He wants Europe to come together to form a consolidated bloc politically, militarily, and, as he is hoping, from a religious sense at all, as well. The Pope is looking forward to the time when the Catholic influence will once again be very strong in Europe. Some other comments from the President of the European Commission. The EU must not only complement NATO, but also react independently and appropriately to external threats. NATO can no longer be used as a convenient alibi to argue against greater European efforts. The US is no longer interested in guaranteeing Europe's security. And another writer, a European army will come faster than many believe. Now, what has this got to do with Ezekiel 38? I think it's got a lot to do, brothers and sisters, because, you see, with the arrival of President Trump, we have a man in control of the US who's made it plain that America's no longer going to go all around the world solving the problems of the world. They will help when they see fit, but their principal interest will be the United States of America. And the European powers, particularly France and Germany, have slowly come to realise that they can't rely upon the support from the US anymore. So they've now got to build up their own defences, their own ways of making sure they can survive. And who should be stepping into that to give them a little push along the road is none other than Pope Francis. He can see where it's going and he wants to be on the bandwagon. Can President Trump be trusted? Well, in June this year, he went to the NATO meeting and everyone was concerned about the future of NATO. In fact, he didn't even spell out in any words that he would agree to Charter 5 or Article 5 of the NATO agreement, which says an attack on any one member of NATO means it's attack upon them all. And so the French and the Germans were particularly wanting to hear from President Trump. They wanted a watertight guarantee from Trump, look, if we are attacked as members of NATO by, for example, the Russians, then will you, the USA, come to our assistance? Well, in June this year, President Trump refused to give that guarantee. But then a month later, at a meeting in Poland of the G20, Trump makes an explicit commitment to NATO's core mutual defence obligation, weeks after declining to do so in Brussels. I am committing the United States to NATO Article 5. Certainly we are there to protect. Now, brothers and sisters and young people, if I was a world leader, if I was a person in control of my country or leading my country, do you think that I would have confidence in what Mr. Trump may do next week or next month? Would you have confidence? I wouldn't have confidence. I'm not saying that he necessarily is a totally bad leader. He may be doing a lot of good things for the US that we do not know about. I listened in the radio coming up here this afternoon that the unemployment rate now in America is down to 4.3%. The stock market is booming. So as far as the USA citizens are concerned, they must think that Mr. Trump is doing the right thing. But when it comes to world political scenes, when it comes to military action, I don't think the world is confident that Mr. Trump or his successor will go the way they would like. So what does that mean? It means that someone is stepping into the vacuum. And that someone is Vladimir Putin and the Russians. So where's going to be the next Russian military intervention? Will it be the Baltic States, Ukraine, Turkey? All of those countries are like sitting ducks once Vladimir Putin decides to act. President Putin said he has no further designs on Ukrainian territory, but said he will stand up for the millions of ethnic Russians on historic Russian lands. And in the screen there, we have the percentage of the population that is Russian in former Soviet republics. And I want you to notice Estonia and Latvia. The number of Russians living in those two countries is 25% or more. So there are a lot of Russian-born people, and possibly citizens, from Russia living in Estonia and Latvia. And they are, together with Lithuania, are the Baltic States. And Europe knows that Vladimir Putin has got his eyes on those Baltic States. Those three nations are members of NATO. So I ask this question. If Russia decided to invade Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania, what do you think the USA will do? Are they going to risk the possibility of a nuclear war to send their armaments over to those little Baltic states and thereby get involved in a horrendous war with Russia? I don't think the US will do it. They're making a lot of signs that they would, but I don't know. President Putin says he's got no designs of those countries. Someone else had similar things to say prior to World War II. Hitler promised the British government this would be his last territorial demand, that is the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia. Eager to avoid war, they believed him. So in 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed, which turned over the Sudetenland, which was the German-speaking area of Czechoslovakia, handed it over to Germany without firing a shot. And Adolf Hitler said to the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, "I can assure you, this is my last territorial demand. Once I get this area, all over Red Rover. We can all settle down and enjoy our scones and cream and jam for afternoon tea." And Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was so excited, and he flew back to England with this bit of paper in his hand. "I have peace in our time." And 6 months later, Hitler just moved in and took over all of Czechoslovakia. And not long after that was the beginning of World War II. Now down the bottom are the Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And I've just shown I suppose a typical meeting of Putin and his advisors as to where do they go next. And I reckon, brothers and sisters, the Baltic states would be high on the agenda. A study by the RAND Corporation, a think tank for the US Congress, warned that Russia could defeat Estonia and Latvia in just 60 hours. We don't want a conflict, but we have a neighbour who is not acting in a predictable way, and it concerns us, said Colonel Jakob Larsen, who commands a NATO force in Lithuania. And I thought that political cartoon on the right is so apt. You've got a big sign, warning, Baltic states protected by NATO, and they're hiding behind the screen. And there you've got the big Russian bear coming up and inquisitively looking at that sign and thinking, you know, I could swallow up that sign in one bite. And they could. And Europe and the US could do nothing about it. Ezekiel 38:7 to a T. "Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them." And there you've got Vladimir Putin pulling across Europe the Iron Curtain. That famous statement uttered by Winston Churchill in the US in 1946. After the end of the Second World War, Churchill went to America to give some talks about how he saw the world scene. And he said he could see that the Russians were drawing an Iron Curtain across Europe. And that certainly happened. And so we had the Cold War. Well, now we have the modern day Iron Curtain gradually being dragged across Europe. And it's exactly how Ezekiel saw it in 38. Be prepared, O Gog, prepare for thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. And we can imagine the soft-speaking leader of Russia, whoever it may be, saying to the Europeans, where's your great friend? Where's the great United States of America that said they would support you and they would back you in all your troubles? Where are they? They're no more here, but I tell you what, I can help you and I can be a guard unto you. It's Ezekiel 38 scenario developing. I want to just talk a bit about the religious situation in Russia. One writer said, well, we've got to understand, for example, Russia is an Orthodox Christian nation. So is Ukraine. That happened in 988 in Crimea, a place called Kiev and Rus. That was the original birthplace of Russia. It was the Russia around Kiev at that time. That happened 1,000 years ago, but to a Russian, it's just like yesterday. So when Ukraine, the birthplace of modern Russia, converted to Christianity in the year 988, so all of that area became part of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And Russia was part of the Orthodox Church under the name of the Russian Orthodox Church. And Vladimir Putin is very heavily involved in the Russian Orthodox Church. Recently in Moscow, there was the unveiling of a new statue of Saint Vladimir. Remember, Saint Vladimir was the ruler that converted all of Kiev to Christianity. Well, now they've erected a statue to this famous saint. And who should be there on the opening? None other than the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, together with Vladimir Putin, marching towards the statue and lay their wreaths. And Russia today, brothers and sisters, now has another saintly Vladimir. Not like the Saint Vladimir of 988. They now have Prince Vladimir Putin, Prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. There will be a religious dimension to the invasion of Israel. Putin is a deeply religious man. He's the first Kremlin leader since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution to publicly profess his faith in the Orthodox Church. Look down the bottom. You have Russian soldiers lining up to kiss an icon of Vladimir Putin. The Russian people love him and they treat him almost like a saint because he has restored some notoriety to the Russian people. In the 1917 Russian Revolution, out of that, under the control of Lenin and Stalin, atheism was the official religion. For the Bolsheviks, top right-hand side, communism was the only religion, and they wanted people to worship the communist state instead of God. Recently, a Newsweek magazine had this heading, Russia turns to Jesus. It would have been heresy to Lenin that they turned to Jesus. But the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church said this in a recent speech. He defined the Russian war in Syria as a conflict against global terrorism and hence suggested a holy war to free not only the Middle East but also the Christian civilization from this fierce and deceitful enemy, which was ISIS. Now, we don't blame anyone being against ISIS, but what is happening now in Russia is that the Russian Orthodox Church has regained the status that it had under the Tsars. And the leader today of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is working hand in glove with the Russian Orthodox Church to achieve his objectives and their objectives. They want to unite and federate the Middle East, the cradle of the faith and of the faiths and strategic axis between the East and West. Now notice what Patriarch Kirill said. He suggested a holy war. You know that's been said before. In Joel chapter 3, verse 9 and 10. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare for a holy war. Call out the something's just happened on my screen, so I've just got to fix it. Call out the warriors. Let all these fierce fighting men approach and attack. So 2,500 years ago, the Bible said it would be a holy war, and today Patriarch Kirill is saying, we think there should be a holy war in the Middle East to establish the true values of Christianity, and Vladimir Putin is making sure that he's right at the forefront of all that. Last year, there was a very historic meeting of Patriarch Kirill and the Pope. I was wondering if Anton could just come up here again and find out if I can just remove something from my screen, because it's playing up again. And this is just, you probably guessed this by now. No, I don't need you now. It's just a ruse to give me another couple of minutes. Now, on the screen there, we have a photo of these two men, Roman Catholic Francis and the Russian Orthodox leader Kirill. They got together, meeting in all places, in Havana, in Cuba. Cuba being one of the most religious nations on earth. They met there. Their objectives was to consider persecution of Christians in the Middle East, Africa and other regions. And commentators have all said that that meeting would never have happened were it not from the backroom organisation of Vladimir Putin. And I think that little photo down the bottom says it all. In the culture war for the future of mankind, Putin is planting Russia's flag firmly on the side of traditional Christianity. Brother Thomas again. As the head of a confederacy of the adherents of the Greek and Latin churches, it will be his policy to cause their priesthoods to be respected as useful cooperators in the subjection of Europe to his will. Yes, the Russian leader, whoever he may be, will work in cahoots with the Russian church and the Catholic Church in the West as useful cooperators in the subjection of Europe to his will. Now, this is an interesting little slide. It's to do with the JWs. And an article written earlier this year in the Guardian UK newspaper. Why Putin's persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses should worry us. Well, what happened? The Russian Supreme Court suppressed the JWs, seized all their property, and if that seizure was not overthrown on appeal, then the JWs would lose their kingdom halls, their headquarters would be taken over by the state, all their literature would be deemed extremist, even Bible translations and even a picture book of Jesus with no words in it at all. Now listen to these words from the JWs. After talking about how they refused military service. The JWs claim their brutal treatment on the resurgent power and authority of the Orthodox Church, which has flourished under Putin, and at the same time revived its historical suspicion and, where possible, persecution of Protestant and Catholic churches. In the Russian state, there are 170,000 JWs. So they're a reasonable number. But brothers and sisters, if the Brotherhood of the Christadelphians was relatively strong in Russia, they would be banned also. Because we don't go to war. We are conscientious objectors. We would not be falling in line with the Russian Orthodox Church. And we likewise would suffer the same treatment. So I thought it was an interesting article to show how that, whereas on one hand Putin and others are trying to portray the Russian state as being benevolent and giving everyone freedom of religion, in real terms this is not the case. And what about Israel? In a phone call, Netanyahu and Putin reaffirmed commitment to mutual ties. Therefore, Son of Man, prophesy and say unto Gog, Thus saith the Lord God, In that day when my people of Israel dwelleth safely, shalt thou not know it. Like in the days of Haman. Haman, who wanted to destroy the Jews, he is described in Esther 9 verse 24 from the Wycliffe version. He thought evil against them, to slay them and to do them away. And someone else is going to think evil. Thou shalt think an evil thought, says the prophet to Gog. You will come down into the land of promise to take a spoil and to take a prey. And all this is developing as we would expect. And to seek, brothers and sisters, is the standard operating procedure for Putin. One commentator had this to say, by the time the international community reach the conclusion that you lied, you and your allies will be so far ahead of the game that it will not matter. James Miller, a Russian expert, had this to say. And in Daniel chapter 11 and in Ezekiel 38, the invasion of Israel and the invasion of Turkey and the invasion of Egypt is presented as a lightning raid. Out of the blue it comes. They weren't expecting it. And that's why that writer said, by the time the international community wakes up to itself, you and your allies will be so far ahead that it won't matter. Brother Thomas again. When therefore the Tsar, Gog, gets possession of Constantinople, he will not be hostile to the Pope. On the contrary, he will honour and acknowledge him and be the enemy of the Holy Land. Now, Brother Paul, I just need 3 or 4 more minutes because of those breaks that I had. But I will finish before the scheduled time of the next study. In Revelation 16, verse 15, we have, he gathered them into a place called Armageddon, which means a heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. Thou shalt ascend, thou shalt come like a storm, thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and thy bands, and many people with thee, the Russian Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, the United Nations of Europe, they'll all be there, coming into the Middle East. And brothers and sisters, do you know one of the reasons why there is going to be this mighty invasion of Israel? Is because Israel needs to be disciplined. Israel needs to know that as a nation, they are guilty before their God. They've turned their back on the one who could save them from their troubles. Do you know that Israel is now considered to be the gay capital of the world? And in particular, Tel Aviv has been named as the world's best gay city. And there in that picture, we have the Holy Land, and alongside it, Israel, the gay capital of the world. And what does Ezekiel say? According to their uncleanness and according to their transgressions have I done unto them and hid my face from them. Now will I have mercy upon the whole house of Israel and will be jealous for my holy name. After they have borne their shame and have suffered because of their iniquities, and have suffered because their trespasses, whereby they have trespassed against me, when they dwelt safely in their land, as they do today, relatively speaking, and none made them afraid. Then, when their judgments come upon them, shall they know that I am the Lord their God. Neither will I hide my face any more from them, for I have poured out my spirit upon the house of Israel, saith the Lord God. And in the prophecies of Isaiah, we have the invasion against Israel by the Assyrian. And the Assyrian, brothers and sisters, and young people and friends, is just a type of Gog today. I think this little section in Isaiah 10 captures the scene. This very day, he, the Assyrian Gog, will halt at Nob, on the right-hand side there. He will shake his fist at the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. And when it looked as though Israel is finished, over and done with, never to rise again, it shall come to pass at the same time, when Gog shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face, for in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there will be a great shaking in the land of Israel, and I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord. Every man's sword shall be against his brother. And in the days of these kings, in the days of that great northern invasion, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Never. And the little stone power will fill the whole earth. This is the finger of God. And we look forward to the time when the finger of God will be seen in action. And so will I show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they, the Jewish people, all around the world, everyone from pole to pole will know that I am Yahweh. And so, brothers and sisters, how privileged we are to be able to study prophecy and see the signs of the times. Prophecy is the mould into which history is poured. So let's take to heart those wonderful words in Peter. So we have the prophetic word made more sure, to which you do well to pay attention, as to a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star arises in your hearts.